"Sir, your card was declined." The waitress held the small payment terminal between them without a hint of judgment, but every pair of eyes in the diner seemed to lift at once. Jonathan Pierce stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him as if it belonged to someone else. 3 months ago, he had been worth $8 billion. Today, he couldn't afford a $3 refill. He reached into his jacket, found a few wrinkled bills, counted them twice, then looked up. "Guess I'm still short." Before he could say another word, the waitress slid $2 onto the counter. "You're covered." Jonathan let out a dry breath. "I don't need charity." "Good," she replied. Because it wasn't charity. It was breakfast. 3 hours earlier, Jonathan stepped out of the federal courthouse into a wall of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted his name from every direction. "Mr. Pierce, did you mislead investors? Did your partners abandon the company? Are you filing for personal bankruptcy?" He ignored every question and kept walking. By the time he reached the sidewalk, the headlines were already spreading faster than he could read them. Pierce Capital, once praised as one of the country's smartest investment firms, had collapsed under the weight of a fraudulent acquisition engineered by executives Jonathan had trusted for more than 20 years. Investigators believed he hadn't orchestrated the deception, but that didn't matter to the public. His name dominated every headline. Before noon, his board had voted him out. By lunch, even the lawyers he'd trusted for years had stopped returning his calls. By sunset, the mansion overlooking Lake Washington belonged to the bank. Jonathan reached for his SUV, only to find a repossession notice tucked beneath the windshield wiper. He closed the door without getting in. He had nowhere he actually wanted to go. He spent the next few hours walking without a destination, passing office towers where people once stood when he entered a room. A few people glanced his way, then looked right through him. Or maybe they pretended not to. As rain began to fall, a small roadside diner appeared at the corner. The glowing sign promised hot coffee and homemade pie. It wasn't a place Jonathan would have noticed a week ago. Inside, conversations drifted between truck drivers, nurses ending overnight shifts, and a retired couple sharing pancakes. The waitress who greeted him wore a faded blue apron and a tired smile. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell. "Table for one?" she asked. Jonathan nodded. "Coffee, please." She returned a minute later, set the mug down, and noticed he hadn't touched it. "Long day?" she asked. Jonathan let out a dry laugh. "Longest of my life." Sarah didn't press him. She simply refilled another customer's coffee before returning with the check a while later. That's when his card failed. That's when she covered the difference herself. Jonathan looked at her with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Sarah met his eyes for the first time. "Because someday you might remember what it felt like when someone treated you like a person instead of a problem." Jonathan lowered his gaze to the coffee between his hands. For decades, he had always known his next step. Now he realized he had absolutely no idea what came next. Jonathan kept turning the warm coffee mug between his hands long after it had stopped steaming. Around him, the morning rush came and went. Plates clattered, the front door chimed every few minutes, and Sarah Mitchell moved from table to table with practiced efficiency. She never looked rushed, even when she clearly had too much to do. Before leaving, Jonathan reached into his pocket and placed the few dollars he still had beside the empty cup. "For the coffee," he said. Sarah glanced at the bills and slid them back. "You might need that more than I do." Jonathan let out a humorless laugh. "You have no idea how true that is." She folded the checkbook under her arm. "Maybe not." He stood, hesitated, then slowly sat back down. It surprised even him. For decades, people had lined up outside his office hoping for 5 minutes of his time. Now he found himself waiting for a waitress to refill a coffee he couldn't afford. Sarah returned with the coffee pot. "You planning on ordering breakfast?" "Can't." "Then I'll keep the coffee coming until my manager tells me otherwise." Jonathan caught her eye. "Why are you being so nice to me?" "Because it's easier than being mean." He managed the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks. It disappeared almost as quickly. "Everything I've spent 40 years building is gone." Sarah leaned against the counter for a second before another customer called her name. "I'll be back." 15 minutes later, the diner had quieted. She returned with a fresh pot and poured another cup. "You were saying?" Jonathan watched raindrops slide across the diner window. "People think losing money is the worst part, isn't it?" "No," he shook his head. It's realizing how many people were only there because you had it. Sarah nodded slowly, as though catching an echo of her own past. That hurts. My board forced me out, he muttered, his gaze tracked to the dark swirl of his coffee. My lawyer won't even return my calls. My own brother texted instead of calling. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. Funny how silence gets louder when you're broke. Sarah let the words hang in the air. Without a word, she turned to refill the cup of an older man sitting alone in the corner, leaving him with his thoughts. He thanked her as if she had done something extraordinary. Only then did she return to Jonathan. Sarah rested both hands on the edge of the booth. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. When was the last time you asked someone for help before today? Jonathan didn't answer. He searched his memory and came up empty. She smiled faintly. That's what I thought. He exhaled. I used to solve everyone else's problems. That's different. How? Because solving problems doesn't mean you know how to need people. The words landed harder than he expected. For years, he had measured every relationship by contracts, performance, and results. He couldn't remember the last conversation that hadn't involved an agenda. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Jonathan made no move toward the door. Let me ask you something, he said at last. If you woke up tomorrow and everything was gone, your savings, your home, your career, what would you do first? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the kitchen, catching the cook and dishwasher laughing over some private joke, something no customer would ever be privy to. She brought her gaze back to Jonathan. You're asking the wrong question. He frowned. I am. Yes. She picked up the empty coffee pot and met his eyes. The better question is, who would still be standing beside you if all those things disappeared? Jonathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. He already knew the answer, and it terrified him. Jonathan sat in the same booth long enough for the lunch crowd to replace the breakfast regulars. No one asked him to leave. Sarah simply kept working, stopping by whenever his coffee cup ran low. Finally, during a lull, she slid into the seat across from him for the first time all morning. You never answered my question, she said. Jonathan absorbed every word. Which one? Who would still be standing beside you? He stared at the tabletop. I can't think of anyone. Sarah gave a slow nod, not surprised by the answer. That must feel pretty lonely. It does. A bell rang from the kitchen. She stood, delivered 2 plates to another table, then returned with a glass of water. You know, she said, people assume I've always been okay because I smile a lot. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Have you? She laughed. Not even close. She folded her arms on the table. 6 years ago, my husband collapsed at work one afternoon. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, he was gone. Emma had just turned 4. Jonathan's expression softened. Sarah continued without dramatics. 3 months later, I lost our house. Medical bills. Missed mortgage payments. Everything happened so fast I barely had time to understand it. Jonathan listened without interrupting. I took the first job I could find, she said. Then a second one. Some days I'd leave home before sunrise and get back after my daughter was asleep. How did you manage? Jonathan asked. Some days I didn't. She grinned at the memory instead of fighting it. I cried in the walk-in freezer more times than I'd like to admit. Jonathan couldn't help smiling. The freezer. Best place in the restaurant. Nobody asks questions. They shared a brief laugh, the first moment that didn't feel weighed down by loss. Sarah leaned back. Eventually I realized something. What? Life wasn't asking me to have all the answers. It was asking me to keep showing up. Jonathan repeated the words under his breath. Keep showing up. That's it. She pointed toward the front door. See that mailman? Jonathan turned as a man in a blue uniform walked in and greeted 3 customers by name. Every Tuesday, Sarah said. He orders the same turkey sandwich, tips $5, and asks how my daughter's doing. He's not rich, but he never forgets people. She motioned toward an elderly couple sharing pie near the window. Those 2 come every Friday. He has early-stage Parkinson's. She cuts his food before he even asks. They've been married 48 years. Jonathan watched them in silence. Sarah glanced back at him. I used to think surviving meant making more fortune. And now I think surviving means refusing to become bitter. Jonathan lowered his eyes. He had spent years measuring success by quarterly reports, market share, and stock prices. Yet the people around him seemed to possess something he had never learned to build. As Sarah stood to return to work, Jonathan spoke before he could stop himself. Would you mind if I came back tomorrow? She beamed. Coffee's always hot. Jonathan gave a quick nod. The crushing weight of his losses finally faded, replaced by a strange new curiosity. He found himself wondering what else he had never noticed. Jonathan returned to the diner the next morning before sunrise. This time, he wasn't wearing the tailored suit that had once become his signature. A plain jacket and faded jeans were all he had left. Sarah held her eyes from filling sugar dispensers and chuckled. You're early. Couldn't sleep. Coffee. If you'll let me pay this time. She accepted the few dollars he placed on the counter without saying a word. Looks like we're making progress already. Jonathan found himself smiling. The morning rush arrived in waves. Truck drivers filled the booths, construction workers crowded around the counter, and nurses coming off night shifts drifted in with tired eyes. Jonathan watched Sarah remember nearly every customer's usual order before they even sat down. Morning, Frank. Extra bacon. You got it. Hi, Mrs. Lewis. Decaf today. You know me too well. Jonathan shook his head. How do you remember all of that? Sarah poured another cup of coffee. I pay attention. To everyone. People like being seen. Jonathan started to answer, then stopped. He couldn't remember the name of the security guard who had opened his office door every morning for nearly a decade. The word stayed with him. In boardrooms, Jonathan had memorized earnings reports down to the decimal. Yet he couldn't remember the name of the receptionist who had greeted him every morning for 12 years. A stack of clean coffee mugs slipped from a nearby tray, sending several rolling across the floor. Before Sarah could move, Jonathan was already on his feet, gathering them. Thanks, she said. Old habit, he replied. I used to solve problems. Sarah grinned. Good. Here's another one. She handed him a towel and pointed toward an empty table. Mind wiping that booth? Jonathan hesitated for half a second. A month ago, he had employed hundreds of people to handle tasks like this. Now he found himself spraying cleaner onto a laminate tabletop while a little boy waited nearby with his grandparents. The little boy waiting for the booth grinned at him and whispered, Thanks, mister. Looks good, the grandfather said as Jonathan stepped aside. Appreciate it. Jonathan nodded. You're welcome. The exchange lasted only seconds, but something about it felt strangely satisfying. Later that morning, Sarah caught him stacking clean plates after a busboy disappeared into the kitchen. You don't have to keep helping, she said. Maybe I do. She tilted her head. Why? Jonathan considered the question. Because for the first time in years, nobody here wants anything from me except a clean table and an honest conversation. Sarah laughed. That's a pretty low bar. Turns out I've been missing it. During a quiet moment, Jonathan noticed an elderly customer struggling to reach the front door with a walker. Without thinking, he crossed the room and held it open. Thank you, son, the man said. Jonathan watched him shuffle toward his pickup truck. Just a simple thank you that somehow felt more genuine than standing ovations he'd received at shareholder meetings. As he returned inside, Sarah placed a slice of apple pie on the counter. On the house, Jonathan studied her for a second. I didn't earn this. Sure you did. She nodded toward the dining room. You've spent all morning seeing people instead of looking past them. Before Jonathan could answer, the front door swung open. A sharply dressed man in an expensive overcoat stepped inside, scanned the diner, and froze the moment he recognized Jonathan. The smile disappeared from the stranger's face as he walked straight toward his table. The man in the overcoat stopped beside Jonathan's table and extended a hand. Jonathan Pierce. I never thought I'd find you here. Jonathan looked up at him. Do I know you? David Collins. We met at the Henderson Investment Summit 2 years ago. Jonathan remembered the name after a moment. David managed a successful private equity firm. They had exchanged business cards, nothing more. David glanced around the diner. I heard what happened. I'm sorry. Jonathan nodded. Most people just read the headlines. Most people don't know the whole story. David slipped a business card onto the table. If you're ready to get back in the game, give me a call. Jonathan shifted his gaze at the card, but didn't pick it up. I'm not sure I even know what game I'm playing anymore. David offered a polite smile before leaving. As the door closed behind him, Sarah walked over carrying a tray of clean dishes. Old business friend. Something like that. She noticed the untouched card. You don't seem excited. A week ago, I would have called him before he reached the parking lot. And today? Jonathan shrugged. Today I don't trust my own instincts. Sarah studied him for a moment. Good. He blinked. Good. Sometimes losing confidence is the first step toward learning. Jonathan laughed under his breath. You have an answer for everything, don't you? Not even close. She checked the clock on the wall. I'm off in 20 minutes. Big plans. Actually, yes. She hesitated. Want to come with me? An hour later, Jonathan followed Sarah into a neighborhood community center a few miles away. Volunteers moved between folding tables stacked with canned food, fresh bread, and grocery bags. Children laughed in one corner while seniors chatted over cups of soup. No one seemed rushed. No one caught sight of embarrassed to ask for help. Sarah greeted nearly everyone by name. Morning, Mrs. Alvarez. Good to see you, Sarah. Hey, Marcus. Your grandson feeling better? Much better, thanks. Jonathan leaned toward her. You know all these people? Some of them. Others I've just met enough times to remember. She handed him a box filled with canned vegetables. Want to help? He accepted it without thinking. For the next hour, Jonathan carried boxes, stocked shelves, and helped families load groceries into shopping carts. A young father thanked him after receiving diapers and milk. An elderly woman insisted on giving Jonathan 2 homemade cookies wrapped in a napkin. For your kindness, she said. Ma'am, you should keep these. She expression softened. I've got another batch cooling at home. Jonathan accepted them, unexpectedly moved by the gesture. As she walked away, Jonathan noticed the cuffs of her sweater had been carefully stitched by hand. She had almost nothing, yet she had insisted on giving away the little she had. On the drive back, he stared out the passenger window. Those people have so little, he said. Some do, Sarah replied. Yet they kept thanking us. Sarah nodded. Some of the most generous people I've met couldn't afford to be generous. Jonathan looked down at the cookies resting in his lap. I spent decades believing wealth meant never needing anyone. And now, she asked. He took a long breath. Now I'm starting to think real wealth might be measured by how many people are willing to stand beside you when you do. A quiet laugh escaped her, but said nothing. As they pulled into the diner's parking lot, Jonathan noticed a black luxury sedan waiting across the street. A man stepped out, holding a leather briefcase. Jonathan recognized him instantly. It wasn't an old acquaintance this time. It was the former business partner whose signature had helped destroy everything. Jonathan froze as the man crossed the parking lot. It was Victor Langley, the former chief operating officer of Pierce Capital and the executive whose hidden deals had triggered the collapse that destroyed Jonathan's reputation. Victor stopped a few feet away. You look different, he said. Jonathan glanced down at his jeans. I could say the same. Victor's lips curled into a smile without warmth. Can we talk? Sarah sensed the tension and quietly headed inside the diner, giving Jonathan space. Victor gestured toward the black sedan. 5 minutes. Jonathan folded his arms. You have too. Victor opened his briefcase and removed a folder. Things have settled down. The investigation is moving in a better direction than you probably realize. Better for who? Jonathan asked. Victor ignored the question. Some very influential people still believe in what you built. They don't care about the headlines. They care about results. Jonathan said nothing. A new investment group is being formed, Victor continued. Clean company. New name. Fresh capital. They want you to lead it. Jonathan let out a short laugh. After everything that happened? People forget faster than you think. Victor slid the folder toward him. The compensation starts at more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Jonathan didn't reach for it. What's the catch? Victor's smile faded. There isn't one. Jonathan held his gaze. Victor. A long silence followed. Finally, Victor sighed. Fine. We move aggressively. Buy distressed companies. Cut costs. Restructure. It's business. Jonathan knew exactly what those words meant. Layoffs. Closed factories. Communities left behind while investors celebrated record returns. It was the same strategy he had approved dozens of times without losing sleep. You're asking me to become the man I used to be, Jonathan said. I'm asking you to become successful again. Through the diner's front window, Sarah was laughing with Frank over something neither of them seemed eager to explain. Nobody in that room knew the size of anyone's bank account. Nobody seemed to care. Victor followed his eyes. Don't tell me you've started taking life advice from a waitress. Jonathan answered without looking away. She's made more sense in 3 days than I've heard in 3 decades. Victor shook his head. You've been humbled. That's understandable. But don't confuse humility with weakness. This is your chance to reclaim everything. Jonathan accepted the folder, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside were financial projections, executive contracts, and numbers that once would have made his pulse race. Instead, all he could think about was a paper bag filled with groceries and an elderly woman insisting he take 2 homemade cookies because kindness deserved kindness. "I need time," Jonathan said. Victor nodded. 48 hours. He handed Jonathan a business card. "Call me before someone else gets the position." The sedan pulled away, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the parking lot. A few moments later, Sarah stepped outside carrying 2 fresh coffees. She handed one to Jonathan and noticed the folder under his arm. "Looks important." Jonathan stared at the card in his other hand. "It might be the biggest decision of my life." Sarah studied his face for a moment. "Then don't ask which choice makes you richer." She waited until he met her eyes. "Ask which choice lets you sleep at night." Jonathan looked back at the folder, suddenly realizing that for the first time in his career, money wasn't the only thing competing for his attention. Jonathan barely slept that night. Victor's folder remained unopened on the small motel desk, while Sarah's question echoed louder with every passing hour. "Which choice lets you sleep at night?" By sunrise, he had made up his mind. At exactly 9 o'clock, Jonathan walked into the downtown office tower where Victor had arranged their meeting. The marble lobby, polished elevators, and glass conference rooms felt strangely familiar, yet completely foreign at the same time. Victor greeted him with a confident smile. "I knew you'd come." Jonathan took a seat but left the folder closed on the table. Around them, several investors waited expectantly. One of them leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, we're excited to have your leadership back." Jonathan slowly scanned the conference room. Months earlier, hearing those words would have filled him with pride. Today, they felt hollow. Victor slid a contract across the table. "Everything's ready. Sign, and we announce the new firm tomorrow morning." Jonathan rested his hand on the pen but didn't pick it up. "Before I answer," he said, "I have one question." Victor nodded. "Go ahead. How many jobs will disappear under this plan?" The room fell quiet. One investor cleared his throat. "Restructuring is never easy." "That's not what I asked." Victor folded his hands. "Some facilities will close. Others will be consolidated. Thousands of positions, most likely. But shareholders will see exceptional returns." Jonathan studied the financial projections one last time. The numbers were flawless. The strategy was familiar. The profit was enormous. Then another image replaced the spreadsheets in his mind. The retired couple sharing pie at the diner, the mailman asking about Sarah's daughter, the father grateful for diapers at the community center, and the elderly woman insisting he accept 2 homemade cookies. For years, he had celebrated balance sheets without ever meeting the people hidden behind them. He quietly pushed the contract back across the table. "I'm not signing." No one spoke. Even the air conditioner seemed louder than anyone at the table. Victor blinked. "Excuse me. I'm done making money by breaking lives." One investor laughed, assuming it was a negotiating tactic. "Name your price." Jonathan shook his head. "You still don't understand." Victor's voice hardened. "Jonathan, this is your chance to rebuild your fortune." "No," Jonathan replied. "It's my chance to repeat my biggest mistake." He stood, leaving the unsigned contract behind. "If I build something again, it won't be this." Victor rose from his chair. "You'll never get another opportunity like this." Jonathan smiled, calmer than he had felt in months. "I certainly hope not." He walked out of the building without looking back. An hour later, he found Sarah clearing tables after the lunch rush. She glanced as he entered. "You look lighter." Jonathan laughed. "I think I am." "So?" she asked. He placed Victor's business card on the counter, tore it cleanly in half, and dropped the pieces into the trash. Sarah didn't celebrate. She simply poured him a fresh cup of coffee. "What's next?" she asked. Jonathan wrapped his hands around the mug. "For the first time in my life," he paused, realizing the answer as he spoke it aloud. "I'm not trying to build the biggest company. I'm trying to build the right one." Sarah smiled. "Now you're asking a much better question." Just then, Jonathan's phone buzzed. It was the first call he had received in weeks from someone whose name he didn't recognize. "Curious," he answered. Within seconds, his expression changed completely. Jonathan lowered the phone slowly and looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded, almost in disbelief. That call wasn't from Wall Street. Who was it? The director of the community center. Sarah waited. He heard I used to help small businesses secure funding. They want advice for a local program that offers microloans to family-owned shops. She grinned. Sounds like they called the right person. Jonathan laughed. A month ago, I would have ignored a call like that. I know. Today, I can't think of anything I'd rather do. Months passed. Jonathan volunteered every Tuesday and Thursday. Jonathan never returned to high-rise boardrooms or luxury investor retreats. Instead, he spent his mornings meeting bakery owners, mechanics, family farms, and neighborhood entrepreneurs who had solid ideas but no access to fair financing. He wasn't writing million-dollar checks anymore. Some investments were no bigger than $25,000. Others required nothing more than introducing two people at the right moment. Again and again, he watched those modest opportunities grow into thriving businesses that transformed entire families. One auto repair shop hired 3 new mechanics within a year. A neighborhood bakery expanded into a second location. A husband and wife landscaping business finally bought the equipment they had rented for years. Jonathan still studied financial statements, but now he always asked one question before approving any investment. How many lives get better if this succeeds? If no one around the business benefited except distant investors, he walked away. Word spread quietly. People who had once dismissed Jonathan as another fallen executive began talking about the businessman helping Main Street instead of chasing Wall Street. The profits came slowly, but they came honestly. 2 years later, Jonathan's new company had grown into a respected investment firm focused entirely on small businesses and community development. He was wealthy again, though nowhere near the billionaire he had once been. Strangely, he no longer cared. Every Friday morning, without fail, Jonathan drove to the same roadside diner. He never called ahead. He never expected special treatment. He always chose the same booth by the window. Sarah would bring his coffee before he even asked. "You're late," she teased one morning as he walked in 5 minutes past his usual time. Jonathan grinned. "Traffic. That's what everyone says." They laughed. Around them, the diner hadn't changed. Frank still ordered extra bacon. Mrs. Lewis still drank decaf. The retired couple still split a slice of pie every Friday. Jonathan knew every one of their names now. More importantly, they knew him, not as the billionaire from the news, not as the man whose company had collapsed, just Jonathan. One afternoon, a young entrepreneur approached his table. "Mr. Pierce." Jonathan studied. "You probably don't remember me," the man said. 3 years ago, you approved a loan when every bank turned me away." Jonathan couldn't help letting out a small laugh. "How's business?" The young man beamed. "We just opened our 4th location. I came here today hoping I'd run into you so I could say thank you." Jonathan stood and shook his hand. "You built it. I just believed you could." After the young man left, Sarah placed another cup of coffee in front of Jonathan. "Looks like your investment paid off." Jonathan watched the man walk out with his family. The best ones always do. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. He placed it gently on the table between them. Sarah glanced at it, then back at him. "What's this?" Jonathan smiled. "Something I've been meaning to give you for a very long time." Sarah glanced at the envelope for a moment before sliding it open. "Jonathan, if this is a check, I'm giving it back." He smiled. "Read it first." She unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, almost deliberate, as though every sentence had taken time to earn its place. "Dear Sarah," she began quietly. "The day we met, I believed I had lost everything that mattered. I was wrong. I had lost everything except the chance to become the person I should have been all along. You never taught me how to become rich again. You taught me why I wanted to become rich in the first place." Sarah paused, her eyes lingering on the page. Jonathan continued from memory. "For years, I thought wealth was measured in numbers. Then you showed me it could also be measured in trust, kindness, and the number of people who smile when you walk into a room. Thank you for seeing a person when everyone else only saw a headline." Sarah folded the letter carefully. "You remembered every word." Jonathan chuckled. "I wrote about 20 drafts. I can believe that." She slipped the letter back into the envelope. "This means more than you probably realize." "It should," Jonathan replied. "It's the most valuable thing I've ever signed." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand for a brief moment. "I'm proud of you." Jonathan looked around the diner. Frank was arguing good-naturedly with the cook about baseball. Mrs. Lewis was laughing with the retired couple by the window. A young mother was helping her little boy color on a paper placemat, while another customer quietly paid for a stranger's breakfast before heading out the door. Years ago, Jonathan would have walked through this room without noticing any of it. Now these ordinary moments felt richer than the celebrations he once hosted in penthouses overlooking city skylines. "You know," Sarah said, topping off his coffee one last time, "people still ask me why you keep coming back here every Friday. What do you tell them?" "I tell them you like the coffee." Jonathan laughed. "That's only half true. What's the other half?" He watched out the window where the morning sun reflected off passing cars. "This is where I met the first person who expected nothing from me, and somehow gave me everything I needed." Sarah smiled but didn't answer. She didn't have to. They sat in comfortable silence, watching people come and go through the front door, each carrying burdens the world couldn't see. Jonathan reached for his wallet when the check arrived. Sarah shook her head. "Not today." He raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She pointed to the small note tucked beside the receipt. Someone had already paid for his breakfast. There was no name, only 6 handwritten words. "Thank you for believing in us." Jonathan looked toward the door, but whoever had left the note was already gone. He smiled, folded the message into his wallet beside Sarah's letter, and lifted his coffee cup. For the first time in his life, he understood that the richest people are not the ones who keep the most, but the ones whose lives leave something valuable behind wherever they go.